Kia ora koutou, ko Dr. Clinicians tuku ingoa. My name is Clinicians. I am going to present to you on this presentation called An Introduction to Tikanga and Māori Data Sovereignty with Biological Data, largely based upon my PhD thesis. I completed at Whare or Awanuiarangi, and then by tweaking my findings and research while working at the Christchurch Art Institute at the Otago University in Christchurch. No mai. So an overview of this presentation, we'll start off with definitions of what Māori data and Māori data sovereignty is, relevant legal instruments, what is a taonga, some practical uses in the lab. So essentially Māori data is any data that is by or about Māori. We also have to realise that all Māori data also has ownership relations with whānau, hapu, iwi, and Māori organisations. So Māori data sovereignty refers to the inherent rights and interests of Māori, whānau, hapu, iwi, and Māori organisations have in relation to the creation, collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, dissemination, reuse, and control of data relating to Māori data, as guaranteed in Article 2 of Te Tiriti. The first legal instrument is called He Whakatonga, Declaration of Independence. This is New Zealand's first constitutional document. It gives Māori and iwi a number of significant rights, including governance and the right to manage and control their own taonga. The next founding constitutional document is Te Tiriti, in 1840 by a number of Māori chiefs. Some confusion with the term the Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi was never signed by Māori. It was simply a translation of the Māori version of Te Tiriti, incorrectly translated. The English version of Te Tiriti, the Treaty of Waitangi, states that Māori ceded sovereignty. Māori version did not state Māori ceded sovereignty. The Waitangi Tribunal and the courts have since ruled that Te Tiriti is the authoritative document that we need to consider as our constitutional document. So the founding document, or the founding constitutional document, for all tikanga and data sovereignty obligations regarding Māori. We also need to be aware of the Mātauranga Declaration, signed in 1993 by Māori and a number of Indigenous peoples around the world. This is more relevant to any iwi in the Mātauranga Confederation, and so it's not so relevant for Māori in, say, the South Island or Māori in the Auckland. The current government that's in New Zealand government right now have made a firm commitment to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, signed in. The current government has a work plan to find out how best to recognise and honour UNDRIP. And all these articles here, ranging from Article 1 to Article 46, are all directly relevant to biological samples and Māori data. So basically, what is a taonga? So a taonga is anything of strategic value, of spiritual value, of any value to Māori. This also includes things such as mātauranga Māori, images, songs, haka, etc., etc. Now, these rights of self-sovereignty of taonga and protection by the government of taonga Māori is directly indicated in Article 2 of Te Tiriti. So a Māori worldview of data, we know that all Māori are born with whakapapa, but not all Māori practice Māori culture. Therefore, there's no one Māori worldview. Much the same way as there's no one Kiwi view of the world, or We have regional views, we have family views, we have sports views. It's very different, as is with Māori. At pre-colonisation, we have stories of Māori data, whether both biological and knowledge data. In 2021, Waitangi Tribunal in Wai 2522 stated that Māori data is a taonga. And this is significant because up until 2021, there was debates with Māori academics and Māori practitioners if data is a taonga. Governments mostly claimed that data was not a taonga. We also have Māori who don't believe data is a taonga. This is usually based on their upbringings, religious beliefs, and more often than not, based on the academic constraints of the institution they work for. This is a cycle of genetic data. Some iwi believe there's an ultimate deity called Eel. Most iwi don't believe in Eel. Most iwi believe that there's two primal parents, Ranginui and Papatūānuku. In the South Island of New Zealand, within the Ngaitahu iwi, it's Papatūānuku and Takaroa who are the first parents. There's variations in their ownership of genetic data. So this is just to be used as an example. So Ranginui and Papatūānuku had a son called Tāne Mahuta. Tāne Mahuta created the first human beings. He also created all the birds and insects and all the living species in New Zealand. So the first person he created was Hiniahuoni. Then from Hiniahuoni and Tāne Mahuta a number of deities. All these deities, we have marae, we have ancestors, we have tribes, we have hapu or clans, family groupings, and then the individual. So together, this whole circle here represents considerations, kaitiakitanga, and ownership of all biological samples. So just for the record, this is for a human species, not another taonga species. Other taonga species will have a number of different deities from Ranginui and Papatūānuku. Most go to Tāne Mahuta, but then there's a number of other deities before we get down to marae. As I said before, it was in 2021 that the government views of data being a taonga changed, and that occurred because of Māori claimants making a claim against the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. This is, again, as I said before, this is significant. Up until 2021, there was so much division about whether genetic and digital data was a taonga or not. Now, it's clear, as academics, as scientists, you must recognise that data is a taonga. That data has mātauranga Māori, and that tikanga needs to be applied to data, whether it's genetic or biological data. Internationally, it's recognised by the United Nations that Indigenous peoples have inherent rights to data. Again, this is significant as it makes it not just a national issue, but an international recognition. There are 6 key kaupapa Māori frameworks which all scientists and researchers should be familiar with. The latest, which this presentation is based on, Tikanga Tawhito Tikanga Hau, Kaitiaki Guideline to DNA Research. It's a big chunky document which is largely based on my PhD. There's a Māori data ethical framework which builds upon Manuka Hinare's ethical ethics framework, and then there's new frameworks depending on if you're using AI, if you're engaging with iwi, other Māori organisations. Hirini Mukumead's tikanga test. There's a number of tikanga tests that allows you to figure out if what you're doing with Māori biological materials is appropriate or not. but you do need a lot of knowledge, traditional knowledge, to be able to work through those tikanga tests. My recommendation would be to hire an expert or engage with an expert in tikanga Māori to go through those tests. The Mason juries, Te Whare Whā, it recognises that any health research requires at least 4 different aspects to be able to do research, all of which are applicable with biological data research. Again, all biological data comes from an iwi, or a marae, and a hapu. We've seen in the recent months the discussions about COVID vaccinations for Māori, and iwi wondering or making statements that perhaps they have ownership rights. This is going to be more and more common in the near future, and I strongly recommend that all biological samples are labelled with iwi, and at least iwi, but hopefully iwi and hapu data. If not, I guess, yeah, my belief is there's going to be a huge amount of issues in the near future if we don't. It's important to understand that all the basically all the biological samples that you have should be called a taonga sample, and all taonga samples don't belong to you as a scientist. You're just merely being the guardian or kaitiaki of that sample, whether that sample is a human being or whether it's from a taonga species. You're only the kaitiaki. And as is the case with much biological research, especially with genetics and genomes, there's the possibility of new research creating IP. It's the best recommendation that there's a partnership or a joint ownership of, or joint kaitiaki of all new IP between your organisation and the Māori iwi hapu that the samples come from. It's important that in all ethics and commitment statements that you do address these 4 legal instruments. Ideally, these will be clearly stated in how you, as a scientist, and how your organisation will commit to each one of these. As I said earlier, the Mātauranga Declaration is only applicable in the Mātauranga Confederation of iwi. He whakaputanga is only applicable to many iwi in the far north and coming down around Hamilton. So it pays to check. We know that hosting digital data and sequencing data overseas is cheaper. It's using Māori data sovereignty principles that you should not be doing that. All Māori biological and digital data should be stored in New Zealand, preferably by a New Zealand company and with servers that use open source. Blockchain technologies is an emerging technology where some iwi, some Māori prefer blockchain technologies, but because of the environmental impact of blockchain technologies, it's not overly preferred. Any hosting or sequencing companies that you deal with, hopefully or ideally should have partnerships with at least mana whenua, if not with mana whenua, at least with Māori organisations. Here's 4 examples why hosting should occur in New Zealand. These 4 statutes remove all privacy from Māori, from New Zealanders, and it's a direct breach of Māori data sovereignty. And I would argue that these laws are a breach of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and if you're a New Zealand researcher, you should be very considerate of these. Again, any whether it's digital or biological data should have a data governance group, and there should at least be a Māori steward on all of those governance roles. Ideally, you would have a Māori data steward, and you'd have a kaitiaki role of a local Māori representative, local iwi representative. As stated earlier, all biological and digital data is a taonga. Body fluids, in addition, are sacred because they originate from Tānei Mahuta, or from Tangaroa and from Papatū. This includes for Taonga species and for human beings. So it's important that the donor or the species, or you as a scientist working on a biological sample, expects that the fluid is tapu, and that when it's being brought into this world, our physical world, that the human donor should be able to recite an appropriate cultural ceremony, or as a scientist / researcher, you should be able to recite a karakia for that sample. And in the Māori world, that sample, it still has a connection to the person that it's from. So it's still a living part of that person, what we call the wairua and the mauri. So it's important to handle those biological samples with respect. There's 3 different options to do a cultural ceremony. The first one's a karakia. For researchers in DHBs, it's have access to a Māori chaplain who can provide relevant religious services. It's also important to realise that there's a number of different services, religious groups in New Zealand. Buddhism, Hinduism, Muslim. There's a whole range of considerations here. The second option is maybe the person who is having the sample taken from them, maybe they don't know a karakia, but maybe it just feels right that they want to be able to say a karakia. It's important that you have some pre-printed karakia for the human donor. For many Māori who are brought up in Te Ao Māori, they should know that which karakia to use, and or they should have be given the opportunity to consult with a kaumātua or a knowledgeable person in their family, or iwi or hapu, or the most appropriate cultural ceremony. So this is just a very basic traditional karakia for when you're taking a blood sample, or in fact any kind of sample. So it's patua nuku he tānei mahuta e hini ahu one te whānau atua o te ira tangata whakatō ia tō koutou mana kitanga ki roto e tēnei poa mātou ai. This can either be read out loud or just said very quietly by the donor or by you as a researcher. So this record is for human samples. All equipment that's being used in the lab should be disposed of appropriately and separately. And, I mean, all Māori samples should be treated as a taonga unless otherwise stated. So all consumables should be put into separate yellow bins with appropriate disposal processes. It's important not to do a process inside a church or inside a place of someone else's religion. It's quite offensive to Māori. Again, I mean, it's not my place to say what shouldn't be done with, say, a Christian or another religious person's sample. That's up to them. But for the purposes of this presentation, this is about Māori samples that are being treated as taonga samples. Again, this is just as a researcher, you could just, when you're disposing of samples, you could do this yourself, or you could have an organisation-wide disposal process. But again, this is just a traditional, safe and simple karakia. So e ngā tō tira tangata, paenga tēnei tō, e oranga mō tōku tinana mea hini ngaro. Whangaia hoki tōku wairua te ora. Haere, haere, haere rā ki te Hawaii ai. So this basically sends the remaining wairua and the mauri of the sample of the donor where they came from. It's a good idea to distinguish between your taonga samples and your non-taonga samples. This is an example using a kawakawa leaf. Kawakawa leaves have significant cultural, physical, and spiritual in Te Ao Māori, which I'm not going to go into in this presentation. An example which you can use. There's no copyright on this sample. It's important to let your donors choose a day which, when they want to do a sample. In Te Ao Māori, we have the mātauranga. Some days it's not a good day to provide a blood sample. So, for example, the Christchurch District Health Board have these free mātauranga. Are probably not 100% accurate for all iwi. I mean, this is more, it looks more like a general sample. But the donor may have their own calendar, their own mātauranga that they want to follow, and they should be given the right to do so. When you have a donor sample and the donor passes away, it's best practice to dispose of that sample immediately. Ideally, you'd offer it back to the whānau or destroy it. Now, there's the argument that people provide a sample for scientific /medical advancement. So I would suggest that using Hiriri Mead's Tikanga framework, you should go through that to see if the sample indeed be returned or not. It should happen on a case basis, and it would be dependent on why the person provided you a sample. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples talks about FPIC, full informed consent. Again, at the time of providing a sample, the donor should be well aware, or should have full knowledge of what will happen to their sample from the time it's extracted to the lab, the disposal. So this is bringing nearly an end to the presentation. I just want to acknowledge, as we do in Te Ao Māori, we acknowledge the whakapapa of mātauranga and of images. So the kawakawa leaf was sourced from Canterbury, South Island. There was a number of staff at Otago University, Christchurch Heart Institute, who created, who from my photo created those labels. And I just want to acknowledge them here. Now, the complete ethical guidelines, Tikanga Tawhito Pangoho Kaitiaki guidelines, are available at this link